One of the pre-work modules that we completed in the school for this September weekend was a seminar that was conducted by a coach named Jamie Smart and a psychologist named Dr. Keith Blevins. This seminar arose out of the three principles understanding. When I started to think about how I would explain this seminar, I went right down the rabbit hole because my stumbling across the three principles was a game changer in my life. For me to just share what I heard in this webinar without giving the backstory on what the three principles means to me really will be, I feel like, a disservice, because what's being said in this webinar isn't meant to be intellectually thought about. It's meant to be an understanding, an embodiment. A man by the name of Sydney Banks, a Scottish welder that moved to Salt Spring Islands, is the founder of the three principles. He passed away about a decade ago. And in the 70s, Sid Banks had an enlightenment experience. And reality for him, as he knew it, shifted forever. Over a period of time, what came out of it was an understanding that's called the three principles: universal mind, universal consciousness, and universal thought. This was something for me that until I had an experience of it, I tried to piece together intellectually and was missing it. I wasn't seeing it. I wasn't sensing it. When I think about being an Indigenous man, I also relate this to receiving linear teachings, like the linear teachings that my ancestors received before residential school. You hear a story, a transmission comes in, and you sit in understanding. The three principles worked that way for me. The first principle of mind points to the oneness of life, the energy that runs through everything like a river. Universal consciousness is like the blue sky that the birds fly through. Consciousness is the sky, being fully conscious and aware of the unchanging truth that resides within. Universal thought is where we take something out of the formless before it's an idea and we make it manifest. In Sid Banks' words, it's a magical paintbrush and it's a spiritual energy. Now here's the backstory on how I came across the three principles. I was at a success conference when I met Ankush Jain. We connected instantly, and he invited me to join his Facebook group, the Powerful Men's Group, Aspiring for Excellence. He also shared with me about his men's immersion that he runs here in the UK. And in talking to him, it was something that was made available to me. There were only 12 men that were going to be there. They're all from different parts of the world. And it would be an opportunity for us to sit together over a 4-day period. At that time, it was 4 days. It's actually extended into a 7-day immersion. We sat together in the understanding of the three principles. And before I went to this immersion, I had no idea what that meant. And in fact, there was a moment during the men's immersion when I was asked to come up and sit at the front of the room in a chair in front of the 11 other men and Ankush. And he asked me why I wanted to come to the immersion. I thought about it for a bit, and what came out of me was this. The reason that I want to come to the men's immersion is because I want to find out what successful people talk about in rooms like this, and then I want to take that back to my home and share it with people. Now, this is where the principles get really interesting. I didn't know what I said at the time, but in that moment, what I came to see was that the reason I was there was for something outside of myself. I wanted to go to the men's immersion to find out what successful people talk about in a room, so I can take that thing that's outside of myself back home and share it with people. What unfolded the next 3 days was an understanding that I really didn't realize was taking place. There was another thing that did happen though. I couldn't see it as it was happening, but I had become very silent and I had gone within. It was very gradual. It was very incremental over those 4 days. There was no abrupt jolt. There was no trying to pound something in my head. There was no opening up a manual and going through a step process. It was sitting in a circle and experiencing. And slowly the understanding took root. So when the immersion ended, I packed my bags and went home. I did something that I never did before prior to that, though. When I was on the airplane back to Canada, I read a whole book. Prior to that, I didn't read books. I would attempt to read books. I would try to read books, but I didn't willingly sit down to ever read a book. And as I read this book, what occurred was that I remained silent. When I got back to Canada that week, I remember going right back to work, but also being silent. I didn't have too much to say, and I didn't have too much to think about. And one night I had fallen asleep on my couch in the living room of my condo. And when I woke up in the morning, I saw the tree that was sitting just out the front window. And I stared at it. I saw the branches, and I followed the branches down to the trunk. And I saw the way the trunk went down into the ground. And I just sort of imagined the way the roots in the tree went into the ground and sort of made up the as above, so below of this tree, this form. And then there was just a picture in my mind of the tree sort of impressing itself upon my chest. And in that moment, I had an insight about something. I had an insight about spiritual energy and divine mind. I saw that the way the tree was growing did it by way of an intelligence. But I didn't see it like that before. I didn't see a tree as containing an energetic life force that didn't need to be told how to grow. It just grew by way of an intelligence. And it was the same way that a flower pitches towards the southern hemisphere and follows the arc of a sun. It does this by way of some type of universal intelligence, some type of universal mind. I thought to myself, I need to go down to Wascana Park. I need to see this in action. So I got in my car, I drove down to Wascana Park, and I walked onto this island that has a little waterfall on it, and I looked at the entire expanse of the lake. When I took a breath in, it was like breathing in the expanse. It was something that I was experiencing internal. And as I took a breath in, I experienced the entire expanse in me because my senses were an internal experience. I realized everything outside of me is an internal experience within me. And the sky is like this thing called consciousness. And the birds flying around are like this thing called thought and mind. The way that the birds fly in a V, they're held together by a universal intelligence, mind. When I saw a bird sort of fly across me, it buzzed me. I thought, man, that happens just like my thoughts. There's like a thought that comes in out of nowhere and it passes through my mind. It stays for a while. I can choose to attach to it or not choose to attach to it. And something happens as a result of that. And then eventually it dissipates. And it had been what I attached myself to throughout my entire life. The constant revisiting of traumatic events that happened in my life, living from the space of what happened to me and who I was, always living from that space and the thinking that arose from it, realizing that I'm living the feeling of my thinking moment to moment. That when someone did something to me in my life, I would have a feeling about it. And so much of the shit that happened to me when I was a little kid, I carried forward. When I was in treatment, they asked me what was my part in the abuse. I sort of thought, how can you ask me a question like that? It seems so unreasonable. Well, what my part in it was that I continued to carry it forward after it happened, unknowingly, out of a place of innocence. And it was all projections of, look at me in pain. Look at me and see me suffer. I need to be seen suffering because I wasn't seen when it happened. The intellect doesn't work well with the simplicity of it. The simplicity of it works very well with the understanding of it. When I feel a yucky feeling, it comes from outside of myself. And that usually when I feel good, it comes from within. Yucky feeling outside in, good feeling inside out. The thing that levels the playing field in this, and Dr. Keith Blevins talked about this in the seminar, is that this inside out, outside in understanding really puts everything at a level playing field. It puts everybody at par. Because sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. When I come from the understanding that I can be outside in about something at any moment and not even realize it, judgmentalism starts to really trend down. That where my thoughts are coming from moment to moment, sometimes I see it and sometimes I don't. The more that the health of the healer's judgmentalism can trend down, the more clarity the health of the healer remains. Physician, heal thyself. It was in that moment that I knew what I was going to do next. I had purchased my first gong about a year before that. And from the 2 gong baths that I did live, I realized I never want to do this again. Because when I sat at the front of the room, it was different than when I would share at a 12-step recovery meeting. It seemed like when I sat at a 12-step recovery meeting, I was able to share openly and honestly about my addiction. But when I was sitting in a room full of people, I didn't know how to share from a place of universal mind. All I found myself doing was giving them a personal experience of my life in drugs. I was recycling this personal story. I didn't want to bring in my concoction of my own personality, and to that extent, and share traumatic events of my life on a public platform. Although I had experienced a shift from my own state of being from attending gong baths, I still really had a hard time explaining what was going on. I just knew that when I attended a gong bath, something happened. I felt good after I left. I didn't feel as nervous. I didn't sense all my agitation. I felt bliss. I felt happy. And what more was, I didn't really need a reason to be happy. Just was able to exist in happiness. As simple as that was to explain right there, I couldn't explain that to an audience when I did a gong bath because my personality was too caught up in the moment. What I wanted to do was be someone that spoke from a place of union. And it seemed that predominantly what was coming out of me was divisive. And when I came to understand the principles, I received a sense of union. Not like it came from outside of me, but that it already was in me. It's not anything that anyone needs to go discover in some far off room. It's the sacred union of you with yourself, ever tapped into the divine. There is no medium between you and your wellness. There was a time in my life when I never thought I could be well, because the only thing that I could see was what happened to me and all of the damage that I created out of the result of what happened to me, behaviors and impulses. But when I look at myself from the place of being innately well, ever tapped into the universal consciousness, the universal mind, universal thought, I can see that I'm innately well. And that from time to time, my personality gets caught up in that. And that's when I get to forgive myself for judging myself. A really beautiful quote that Dr. Keith Blevins shared was about Michelangelo. Michelangelo was asked, "How did you carve David?" And Michelangelo said, "David was already in the marble. I just took away the parts that weren't David." There's another quote that I use pretty much every time before a gong bath, and that's that for thousands of years, the gong has been compared to the sun, and the sun is like fire, and the fire burns up everything that we're not. There's pieces of my personality that help, and there's pieces of my personality that can hurt. Another quote that was shared in the seminar was, "There is no practical way to get to the now. The now is what's left over when I'm not outside in." and outside in thinking can only be seen in the moment. This understanding was where it really started to occur for me. It was when this understanding came to fruition for me that I actually saw that I might be able to help someone. Not that I didn't help people before. It just happened in a different way. That the way that I was going to be able to serve people from this moment forward would help them access their own truth. And it was in this understanding that I actually believed I had a chance, because I was able to experience truth for what it is for me. Not because somebody told me that this was the truth, but that I was able to drop my intellectualization around it and experience it for what it was. It was an experience that became an embodiment that becomes lived out in my day-to-day life. And I still struggle. The benefit of it is I don't struggle for a couple of months anymore. I might struggle for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. There is the potential for creation in each moment because there is an infinite amount of now. This is why I love the saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Every single person that we come across in our day-to-day life is the teacher. It isn't one person, at least not for me. I remember an elder saying, it's important to humble ourselves to the children because the children help us remember who we are. This is where really techniques versus understandings comes in for me. Techniques works with what's already been created and brought into form. Understanding is that each moment is an infinite now, ready to be created and brought into form. And this, for me, is what carries the wisdom of the ages. This helps me understand when I hear the word divine transmission or things being channeled and spoken forward into life. Indigenous people for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years sat in circles, and their energy fields overlapped each other as they sat in circles. And the energy that traveled in that circle was understanding. For me, this is like receiving the vertical teachings of my people. When we don't receive the vertical teachings of our ancestors, we move into horizontal survival mode. Now, that might not be true for everyone. It's true for me. It's true for my experience. That because I didn't know who I truly was, when something would happen, I would immediately move into horizontal survival mode. An elder said something to a young kid. He said, "Do you have a dream?" And the kid said, "No." And the elder says, "Then that's your problem." I hear him say it two ways when he says that. There's the root of your problems, is that you don't have a dream. And to have a dream, you need to know that you have a spirit. And to know that you have a spirit is to know that you're connected to the divine. And to know that you're connected to the divine is to know who you are. And that you get to create yourself moment to moment as a creator. Life is living moment to moment and living with the presence of being in each of those moments.